George W. Bush Sr. was born in Milton, Massachusetts on June 12, 1944. He had a wealthy background, but he was raised to be modest. His parents stressed the importance of public service and giving back to society. His father was a senator. He went to Phillips Academy, Andover, a private boarding school in Massachusetts. He was captain of the soccer and baseball teams, so he was used to being a leader. In July 1943, he became the youngest pilot ever in the Navy. He ran 58 combat missions in the Pacific Theater. When he returned, he married Barbara Pierce in Rye, New York on January 6, 1945. He had 6 children with her. After the war, he enrolled at Yale and earned a degree in economics and graduated in 1948. He moved to Texas and got into the oil sales business. He was a conservative and made ties to the Republican Party. He was very good with people and even ran for position in the Senate in 1964 but failed to win. In 1966, he ran for a seat in the House of the U.S. Representatives from Houston's 7th District and won the re-election in 1968. He got on the Ways and Means Committee, which is uncommon for a new member. He ran for the Senate again in 1970 but lost. Then Nixon appointed him as an ambassador to the UN. He made influential friends. He became friendly with foreign powers that would help him in the future. Nixon asked Bush to serve on the Republican National Committee. They wanted him because he was respectable and had integrity. He stepped down from the RNC when Ford became president. Ford made Bush the U.S. envoy to the People's Republic of China. Bush was chief of U.S. liaison's office for 2 years. When he came back to America, he became the CIA director in 1975. Carter did not let Bush continue to be the CIA director when he came into power. Bush ran for a Republican nomination in 1979. He won the Iowa caucus and called Reagan's plan for the economy voodoo economics. But then Reagan won in New Hampshire, and from then on there was no chance for Bush. Bush became Reagan's vice president and was forced to change some of his political views. Reagan won the election, and then the Senate became Republican-dominated too. However, Bush's lavish childhood and wealthy background made it hard for Reagan to connect with the average American, and it was also questioned if Bush agreed with how conservative Reagan was. But when Bush eventually became president in 1989, he was able to incorporate his own views on domestic policy.
George H.W. Bush's domestic policies were often seen as a failure. In fact, the first part of it was regarding the federal budget. Bush took office in 1989 where the federal budget debt was $2.8 trillion. The government did not have the money for any large new domestic ventures, nor did the political climate lend itself to enacting them. To compensate, Bush stressed a limited agenda that included volunteerism, which is community involvement, education reform, and anti-drug efforts. Bush won the presidency by vowing to maintain the status quo and preserve the legacy of his predecessor.
President Bush tonight speaking from the Oval Office, his first nationally televised address from that office, talking about expanding the war on drugs both in this country and in Central America. His advisor said earlier today that his ultimate goal is to reduce the use of drugs in this country by 10%, that's a modest goal, over the next 2 years, and by 50% over the next 10 years.
In February 1989, many savings and loans industries failed. The president reached a compromise with Congress that ended up costing taxpayers more than $100 billion, which only added to the difficult financial environment that Bush confronted during his presidency.
Read my lips. No new taxes. I will keep America moving forward, always forward, for a better America, for an endless, enduring dream and 1,000 points of light. This is my mission, and I will complete it.
Next is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The bill made it illegal for employers to discriminate against the disabled, guaranteed the disabled adequate access to places of business and public venues, expanded access to transportation, and provided for equivalent access to telecommunications. Conservatives complained about government involvement in the private sector due to this, but the Bush administration made it possible for the disabled people to be less dependent on the government by giving them the chance to hold jobs and leave welfare roles. Conservatives cite the ADA as the example of Bush's betrayal of the Reagan Revolution. And finally, it is regarding the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. The environmental disaster aided his efforts. In March 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker ran aground, and more than 10 million gallons of oil spilled into the Prince William Sound in Alaska. The Exxon Valdez disaster made the public more receptive to the need for environmental protection. Bush also showed his support to the environment by appointing William Riley to lead the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, in 1989. The 1990 amendments focused on three aspects of clean air: reducing urban smog, curbing acid rain, and eliminating industrial emissions of toxic chemicals. However, people were concerned about the cost of the issue, but Bush pursued and signed the act on November 15, 1990. Overall, all these domestic policies always go contradictory with conservative values, thus showing his failures in domestic policy.
On the other hand, Bush's foreign policy was very successful, starting with the Panama conflict in 1989, when the United States invaded Panama in an attempt to overthrow military dictator Manuel Noriega, who had been indicted in the United States on drug trafficking charges and was accused of suppressing democracy in Panama and endangering U.S. nationals.
My fellow citizens, last night I ordered U.S. military forces to Panama. No president takes such action lightly.
Noriega's Panamanian Defense Forces, or short PDF, were promptly crushed, forcing the dictator to seek asylum with the Vatican nuncio in Panama City, where he surrendered on January 3, 1990. Later in 1992, Noriega was found guilty on 8 counts of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering, marking the first time in history that a U.S. jury convicted a foreign leader of criminal charges. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. This marked the beginning of Bush's foreign policy as very successful. Next, in 1991, when the Soviet Union has fallen, nobody knew where the Soviet countries were heading. But Bush took this problem head on and increased the relationship between U.S. and ex-USSR countries. After the fall of Soviet Union, Bush has met the ex-Soviet leader and now Russia leader Gorbachev multiple times, such as the Malta Conference, and has heavily increased the relationship between Russia and U.S. Such a head-on approach showed to the citizens of the U.S. that Bush knew what he was doing on the foreign front. Next, mid-January 1991, Bush ordered the U.S.-led air offensive known as Operation Desert Storm on the country of Iraq. The Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion and occupation of neighboring Kuwait in August 1990, and alarmed by these actions, fellow Arab powers such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt called on the United States and other Western nations to intervene. Hussein defied United Nations Security Council demands to withdraw from Kuwait, and that prompted Bush's attack. President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28th. By that time, most of Iraqi forces in Kuwait had either surrendered or fled. Though the Persian Gulf War was initially considered an unqualified success for the international coalition, simmering conflict in the troubled region led to a second Gulf War known as the Iraq War that began in 2003. And the last conflict that Bush had to face during his presidency was the Somalia Civil War in 1992. In 1992, President George H. Bush ordered 28,000 U.S. troops to Somalia, a war-torn East African nation where rival warlords were preventing the distribution of humanitarian aids to thousands of starving Somalis. In a military mission he described as God's work, Bush said that America must act to save more than 1 million Somali lives, but reassured the Americans, and I quote, "This operation is not open-ended. We will not stay one day longer than is absolutely necessary." Unfortunately, America's humanitarian troops embroiled in Somalia's political conflict, and the controversial mission stretched on for 15 months before being abruptly called off by President Bill Clinton in 1993. This is the only dark spot on the Bush's foreign policy, and this proves that Bush's foreign policy was very successful and very productive in U.S. foreign relations.
Bush is now known for being a transformative president. He was able to pack 8 years of action into 4, as he was a results-oriented type of president. However, in the minds of voters, his achievements in foreign policy were not enough to overshadow the economic recession, and in 1992, the American public voted for change. Critics charged that his administration lacked vision and did not communicate its approach effectively to the public. Bush had a conservative nature and was uncomfortable with bold, dramatic change, preferring stability. These characteristics helped him lead the United States through a period of geopolitical transition. Although the Bush administration often had little control over the unfolding of world events, its responses helped avoid chaos. His refusal to gloat or declare victory during the collapse of the Soviet Empire helped Mikhail Gorbachev and diffuse the possible backlash from the hardliners in the Soviet government. His refusal to gloat or declare victory during the collapse of the Soviet Empire helped Mikhail Gorbachev and diffused a possible backlash from the hardliners in the Soviet government. President Bush showed that he could act unilaterally, such as in Panama, but he was also able to form large, diverse coalitions, such as in the Persian Gulf War. His actions in the world gave the U.S. a name as a world policeman. He's also known for his domestic policies as well, which set up the prosperity of the 1990s. The Clean Air Act was the first time anyone brought market-based principles into the environmental world and has now been mimicked in legislation all over the world. President Bush is also known for his two sons, George and Jeb, who have both been successful in their political careers. George W. Bush was the 43rd President of the United States, and he had 2 terms in office. Jeb was the governor of Florida and also ran for president, but he was unsuccessful in his campaign.